Well, this is great. Thanks everybody for coming. We're almost at standing room here. So I'm Andy Kunka. I'm a professor of English at the University of South Carolina in Sumter, and where I teach about comics, and I've written some books about comics. One called Autobiographical Comics, another The Life and Comics of Howard Cruz, Taking Risks in the Service of Truth, which was nominated for an Eisner Award.
I love Howard.
And the forthcoming Introduction to American Comics, which will be out at the end of October. But you're here to see these three people and not me. So we've got Derf Backderf, Chris Oliveros, and Nate Powell here, and we'll be talking about the topic here is nonfiction comics and history, youth explosion.
Who came up with that title?
Bad. So I just said okay because I don't want to come up with another title. But basically what we're going to be talking about is kind of the history of like youth protest and in relationship to works that these three creators have done. Derf's Kent State, Chris's latest book, Are You Willing to Die for the Cause? And of course Nate with March and Save It for Later. But I want to start out is, I know, Derf, you kind of collect the representations of like youth protest in 60s and 70s comics. So what can we kind of start out, like what were those contemporaneous representations like?
Oh man, I should have sent you some examples. There actually were some in mainstream comics. It was amazing that they popped up as early as they did, and they were not, horribly unflattering, considering that the politics were pretty revolutionary in 1970. I mean, it was like the culture war now amplified by about 50 to get back to 1970. It's one of the worst years we've ever had. And this is on the heels of 5 or 6 really tough years in this country in particular, but really worldwide. So yeah, it did pop up in mainstream comics. There's this, the Marvel stuff tended to be kind of mealy. It was like, Stan wanted everybody to get along, and there was always some supervillain manipulating people with mind control to get them to the protest. But once in a while, it would really slip in, and National Lampoon came along at the time, and their comics were just, over the top. Mad Magazine, I mean, it's really fun to try to track them down. The DC stuff was really reactionary. That's even more fun to look at now. But it was all very mostly it was either unflattering or kind of a put down. Because these people making the comics were all in their 50s or 60s. So, the generation gap in this era that we're talking about was so vast that they weren't even speaking the same language. So it took a while to really to start seeing some more revolutionary thought winding up in comics.
Yeah, and that generation gap was especially within the comic industry too, right? There were very few creators that would have been terribly sympathetic with.
Until those guys like Steve Englehart and Steve Gerber showed up, and they were all smoking weed and dropping acid. And then we started to see some more interesting stuff.
And Nate, you kind of cover some of these generational differences and like kind of the contemporary stuff and Save It for Later, and like I was really kind of struck and moved by the scene where you're watching the Linda Carter Wonder Woman series with your daughter, and you've got R.D. Johnson playing a Nazi, and that was pretty typical at the time of like that, Nazis were parodied, and we think about like Mel Brooks and the Blues Brothers with Illinois Nazis, and like, so can you talk about like how, kind of watching those images from your childhood and then having to explain them to your daughter?
You bet. I'd say with both Save It for Later and March, and even a lot of my fictional stuff, maybe one of the 3 biggest topical threads that runs through a lot of my work is intergenerational reckoning. With Save It for Later, it's because it goes both ways with like me as a tail end Generation X person being in the middle, like recognizing, blind spots and assumptions from my baby boomer Southern parents, but then recognizing that now I'm a dad of a new generation of children and like in real time trying hard to equip them with what they need to get to like process the world that we all know very well, but then being blind myself to the fact that I am not aware of what I'm already out of touch with. And so with like in particular, when a certain threshold is passed culturally or historically, and you don't know it's passed until you've crossed over the threshold. So with the ability to parody Nazis in pop culture and what that does, like a lot of what I write about in that little section is the fundamental shift that has happened within the last 20 years of a collective living memory of Nazi Germany and people who fought Nazis in Europe. And so particularly as a part of a larger, like before the resurgence of a new global authoritarian, white supremacist movement that really was almost vanquished by the late 90s, but recognizing as a child of the 80s, watching 60s and 70s programming, that living memory is what allowed the reference point to actually allow comedy to do its work. Yesterday in another nonfiction panel, Ben Passmore made some really interesting points about like the futility on many levels of sarcasm and humor in actually having power to confront or cut down fascists. But in a pop cultural sense, I still think that was actually true in the broadest sense with post-World War II, pre-9/11 programming. It was a part of cultural healing to be able to keep on shining a spotlight and ridiculing what was at the time considered a vanquished authoritarian force, regardless of how it still very much existed in the United States at the time. But yeah, once I would start having to like explain a thing or two to my very young child, I had not yet realized how, like when you open up that door, all of a sudden you've already said too much and it does not make sense. And it just becomes incomprehensible.
Now, Chris, your book is about Quebec in.
Well, welcome to Cartoon Crossroads. New York Times best-selling author Jerry Kraft is at Atrium for signing and photos. He will be signing until 2:30 p.m. today. See you there.
So comforting.
That's way too chipper for day two of a comic convention.
About the Quebec independence movement in the 60s, which I was interested in reading about because my only understanding of it really came from when I was a kid. There was the villain Plastique in the Firestorm comics, who had been a separatist and had like bombs on her costume that she would throw, and that she became a member of the Suicide Squad later. But that happened in the backdrop of like this international youth movement. But what I found interesting in your book is how this movement had these fits and starts with different kind of leaders at the center, and that it only kind of started to really involve younger people in the like second phase or so. But what led like 16, 17-year-olds to join this movement in the first place and start, making and throwing bombs?
Well, I think it was part of a wider international movement at the time. So a lot of these movements were influenced by what was happening in South America in particular, in Europe, but most especially with Fidel Castro and Che Guevara in Cuba, because they actually were what I believe is the only success. They had the only successful revolution where they had this ragtag army and they were able to overthrow the government. So then when that happened in 1959, you had all these other movements believing that they too could form, even if they were like 20 guys, in some cases they were, a dozen, less than a dozen. And they would have these wild dreams of overthrowing the government. And I think the reason why it became so kind of more prevalent in Quebec in particular is because Quebec is the only province or territory in all of North America that's not essentially English. So the majority, about 85% or so, are French speaking, but the French speaking majority were actually discriminated against, and they made half the wages of their English counterparts and so on. So I think that those two things together, a revolutionary movement and then a majority of the population being oppressed, inspired so many people to form this movement, or this series of movements, because it wasn't just one.
So was it for the 16, 17-year-olds you show in the book, was it their prospects for the future that they were kind of thinking about and getting involved in this to help possibly improve those, not seeing any other options?
I think that was largely the case. I mean, they believed, especially for young people at that age, you tend to be a lot more idealistic, and that you tend to believe that anything is possible, and they really believed that they could overthrow the government. I mean, it's sort of hard to fathom that anyone could believe that, but that's, you had all these people, and over and over again, you had these different cells would get rounded up by the police, they would be thrown in jail, but then a year later, a completely different group would form and take their place.
Mm-hmm. And one of the figures you touch on, and I really like how the book is structured, first of all, by this documentary that didn't exist, right? But interviews with these different figures that you kind of center on for each kind of phase of this early part of this movement, that shooters, that's how it's pronounced, right? Because I think people call him that, or pronounce it that way in the book. That he claimed to have some connection with Castro, and but there's some doubts about that. Is that right?
Yeah, because the way that I tell this story is I try to be. I try not to take any stand on any of these issues. So I try to sort of present things from different viewpoints, and I leave it up to the reader to decide. Because history essentially is like, it all sort of depends on who is telling it, right? So people can have, you could see the same scene. If someone sees like some, accident or robbery outside, there might be 10 people who will more or less describe what happened, but some people might have a completely different take on what it means, and so on. So that's sort of how I try to present events in the book. And so you have this one of the founders, who actually was from Belgium, of all places. He said that he had direct contact with Fidel Castro. I had doubts, but it actually does turn out that, and there was several books and articles that I cited that actually did show that he did meet Castro, and he was actually invited to Cuba as a guest of Castro.
It's not, I mean, that's perfectly believable. I mean, the student radical leaders at the heart of what led to Kent State, they all went to Cuba and met with Castro, the Weathermen, who some of you may have heard of. And they were the extreme radical fringe of Students for Democratic Society, which was the biggest student anti-war revolutionary group. And actually had a big presence here in Columbus, by the way. They had several safe houses here in Columbus, but they actually met with Castro, so that's
They did
documented.
too. Okay.
So it's not at all preposterous to think of.
Actually, we've got an image coming up here on the. I've got this on automatic, but the Derf. This is the opening page of Kent State, and
That was a fun 2 days. 2 days of drawing.
And is it this is I like how this opens the book, because this doesn't have to be taking place in the 70s. This could be 2016, could be
Well, 2020 is when the book came out, yeah, and that was, I finished the book, and then the pandemic hit, and so the book release was delayed until the fall, and that summer the BLM protest blew up, and suddenly we've got these mysterious armed troops in Portland or wherever else they were, and people getting gassed. Yeah, right. We had a bad scene here in Columbus, bad scene in Cleveland. And I'm just sitting there thinking, oh my God, it's going to happen again. And it's a miracle, I think, that it didn't.
But we've now had a whole.
What was your question about the drawing? I'm sorry.
Oh, you're leading into what my question was or is about the drawing, and that part of what Kent State deals with, among all the facets of that, is the college administration's response to these events. And we're seeing now college administrations dealing with protests.
Yes.
Are they?
Yes.
Are they?
I am currently not on speaking terms with my alma mater because of what they did during the Gaza protests and the arrests and the snipers on the roof of the Ohio Union. I was just absolutely appalled.
So is history repeating itself? Does there seem to be any lessons that have been learned from?
If there are, we seem to be unwilling to learn them. The difference between 1970, and I think this probably applies across the board, whether you're talking about March or Chris's book or Kent State, and now, is that since these events happened, governments have spent billions of dollars developing and deploying a vast array of non-lethal crowd control armaments and techniques with the express purpose of getting us to shut up. And they don't have to shoot us anymore because they have so much weaponry at their disposal. But the intent is still the same, to silence dissent. And now, it's like, they're tracking people down, they're throwing them out of college. There was just an article in The Guardian about, I think it was The Guardian, about non-violent protest, climate change protests being thrown in prison. And there's a campaign to do so. Nothing has changed. They've just perfected it.
Yeah, at the University of South Carolina, just like a couple weeks ago, we had what was being described as a free speech event, which was also billed as a roast of Kamala Harris. They spelled her name wrong intentionally.
Free speech only applies to the far right.
Right. And the University of South Carolina, like many schools, both in the U.S. and I know it's in Canada too, have adopted what's known as the Chicago Principles for their free speech policies, I guess, which look on paper like they make sense, but the main purpose of them seems to be to allow these kind of free speech events that are like repugnant to most people, and to dispel protest, to not to say that protesting an event like that would be hindering the free speech of those involved in the event, which seems, again, so that not only with the armaments and things like that, trying to silence or prevent protests, but by having policies that in the name of free speech are going to actually prevent these kinds of protests.
The last invited speaker at Kent State was Kyle Rittenhouse. And he spoke at the Student Center, which is 100 yards from the site where the 4 students fell. It's an abomination, but in the name of free speech.
With Kent State too, and this is a question for Nate. You show how your kids are growing up in this new age of youth protest, and it, seeing the scenes where your kids are like, are we gonna march, because they've been March has been a part of their entire lives.
Part of the household.
Yeah. And that, even I remember growing up in the 70s and thinking that that's what it was going to happen when I got to college too, that we were going to be engaged in these protests like that. But so your kids seem to, they're growing up in a new age of youth protests, but they also seem strongly then influenced by the past based on your influence. Have you talked to them about events like Kent State, and the ones, because you're very careful in the age that they are in the book to not get into some of the more violent things. Has that progressed since?
Right. I mean, the basis was in a rolling way, learning through errors, what the limitation of giving a kid information is before they start to check out. Mm-hmm. And interestingly, I have 2 kids now, almost 13, 9.5, but these were very young children, including newborns in Save It for Later. So most of the focus was on my then 4 to 7-year-old Harper. And both kids are very smart, but it's interesting because my younger kid, who's now 9.5, then grew up sort of being on getting just the detritus from the information flow to the older sister. And some of it, interestingly, I mean, they both have read and own copies of Save It for Later and stuff, but the shift is noticeable because with my younger kid, when I would be explaining something, she'd be like, here's a question about this. How does that work? Maybe as a 7-year-old or something. And I would start to explain it, and I thought I would have learned my lessons. I'm like, okay, pick a chunk, the correct size chunk. And I start going, and I'm like, yes, point A and point B, maybe a little bit of point C. But thankfully, she was articulate enough, and maybe even had read that exact section from Save It for Later, where she'd just be like, Dad, you're already just saying too much. And I was like, thank you. And so in a sense, that's sort of mission accomplished, not only on a parenting level by failing, but not only mission accomplished there, but also maybe as a cartoonist, where I was able to kind of work it out, articulate my own failures. But then at the same time, I think about times when I would have been a small kid or whatever, and it wasn't in my wheelhouse, or it wasn't considered a possibility to be parent, stop over explaining or whatever. You just check out. So it's interesting because the nature of parenting is the nature of failing and learning and trying again. But it's another major theme in Save It for Later is now that I'm the parent is quicker than you think, it's time to shut up and listen to your kids when they call you out, even if they're 7 years old. And that's just one of those things where well, I raised my kid right with these skills, and here they are ready to use them. And I'm like, okay, I'll stop talking to you. And she's like, thanks. And basically yeah, when I'm maybe 2 or 3 years older, add those extra points in. And I'm like, thank you, my child.
So are they, other than your own work, are they seeking out information on their own?
Oh, okay. So my older kid, now 7th grade, my wife and I, Rachel and I, obviously going through the 2015 to 2020 era as parents, we basically internalized. We're like, okay, this is just a part of the fabric of our lives, is updating our kids at their level and not keeping them in the dark about something that they even maybe need to know about. And so now that Harper is a middle school kid and is absorbing information, this is the kind of thing where, like, just like if you grow up in a cartoonist's house and kids like to draw and everything, but you don't want to push them too hard to do art because you don't want to make it uncool or whatever. It's sort of the same thing with social and political information, I find, where I'm like, well, they know, they hear us always talking about this and worrying about this. I don't need to give them like a weekly debriefing. And so now it's actually been more valuable, especially because it's like adolescent tude is emerging, but to have our 12-year-old just wait for her to be like, so like, are you worried about this election? Or asking about Israel and Gaza and stuff. And like, it's been reassuring though, because like, even when we decide to wait for our kid to pop these questions, they are always absorbing information, even if it's not explicitly or intentionally coming from us. They're always processing, always assembling questions. It's just that the ability to reflect and the complexity of the questions grows so much faster than I thought possible. And so in real time, just being like, wow, okay, now we're really talking about something.
So, Chris, what, like, with the events that you detail here in this book, and I know there's a second book about the what are, I guess, really climactic events of 1970. Is that right?
Yeah.
Like, how is that
1970.
How is that like dealt with culturally in Quebec? Are kids taught about it? Is it a subject in school? Are there documentaries and things on TV about it, or is it relatively forgotten?
It's people are taught about it to some degree. I mean, I actually first learned about it myself when I was in high school, and we saw in our Canadian history class, we saw a documentary about it. But for the most part, even in Canada and even in Quebec, I would say most people might be able to give a summary of about 2 sentences of what happened, in particular for this period in the 1960s. And when I was working on the book, I have this unusual situation. I grew up in Quebec and I live in Montreal. I'm the English speaking minority. So I was a little bit nervous doing this book because this talks about issues of relating to the French-speaking majority. But when it came out, and there's a French edition too, so I did events in French for the French edition, and people really, even French speakers, really appreciated it. And learned a lot from it, because, like I said, a lot of the details have been forgotten. There's really just like, for example, from Kent State, I'm sure like some Americans probably have heard about the shootings and the 4 people were killed, but would probably not be able to recount anything nearly, what you have recounted in all the detail with all the research you've done. So it's kind of like that. Like people will sort of just get the initial idea without having any of the backstory.
And can you like, I know that this will be dealt with later, but can kind of summarize where the book, where you're going next? Like what did happen in 1970 then that this is building towards?
Yeah, so the one piece of history that's sort of known in Canada and Quebec about this movement, the FLQ, is what happened in 1970, which was referred to as the October Crisis, and there were actually political kidnappings that were inspired by what was happening in Brazil and Uruguay and Argentina. And so these groups kidnapped people and believed that the government was going to just cave in right away, which is what happened in South America. but the government didn't. And so there was all sorts of tragedies that happened as a result of that. And that's sort of the slightly better known event, and that's what I'm working on now.
I've got up here one of the major events that you described, and that when you talked about earlier the different points of view, and this is one of those events that gets told from multiple points of view of people who are in the building, the bomb, the one who dropped off the bomb, and so on, and so and you depict the way you depict the explosions is similar throughout the book. Could you talk a little bit about how you chose that particular, like the cloud with the boom in it as a way of drawing the explosions?
I guess it's just sort of the stylistic approach of the book. There's two things. I've been reading a lot of John Stanley comics, and I think he's like an absolute genius. And I know, like, you would never think of John Stanley, who is this fantastic cartoonist who did the Little Lulu and many kids comics in the 1950s and 60s. So you wouldn't, I know it seems like a mismatch for a subject like this, but I did try to go for a retro look of the book, because it does take place in the 1960s, and so even the coloring palette and so on. The other thing too is that when I was growing up reading comics, I loved the language of comics and, explosions and the sound effects and so on. When years later, when I started drawing quarterly, I guess we're part of this movement of making more serious comics, if you want to call it that. And they tend to be a lot more personal comics. And a lot of those comics were sort of like in contrast to all the mainstream and superhero comics. But as I said, I really love that comics language, and I wanted to sort of try to recapture that. It's not just me. There's many other cartoonists who've been doing it. People like Sammy Harkin, and actually in your book too, you use a lot of that too.
I love sound effects,
yeah, just the explosions with the smoke and so on, and
Mad
Chester.
Magazine, a lot of mine come right. I mean, Spy versus Spy would be the little boom with the cloud.
Right. So there's all that amazing comics language that was developed in the very early 20th century, and then continued right for many decades on. And so I thought that particular comics language was sort of too good to sort of pass up.
I would also like to add that I think particularly with heavy and brutal historical content, you have to find your own personal line as an artist, but it is helpful to a degree to, no pun intended, soften the blow of your content by leaning into the visual language of comics. And you have to know when you're actually doing on the other side of that, when you're doing a disservice to, what's happening to the real people who you're depicting. But it is helpful up into that point so that people can, it's still a reading experience. It allows the reader to stay on the ride. Like the joy of comics is we get to stop and take a breather if we need to, but this helps us stay on the ride a little bit longer. And each reader, is able to kind of find their balance as well, thanks to the Powells and the Kablooies.
Or you can use it to shove their face against the glass.
Yes.
Because, the shooting in Kent State takes place over 15 pages, and it lasted 13 seconds. So it's every character showing what happened to him and how those bullets hit, and there's a sound effect with most of them, and it's grisly.
That also produces a cognitive dissonance particularly in that scene in Kent State.
Yeah.
And I remember having that revulsion,
Yeah.
like actual horror, and a lot of it was the cognitive dissonance of seeing the sound effects and the puffs of smoke being discharged, and knowing and seeing the actual human consequences. Like,
Right.
well done, Derf.
Well, that brings me to this, actually. This once I had a question for you, Nate, about this. So this is good. The way you depict your daughter as a unicorn child,
I love
like,
that.
and that's part of the visual language of comics as well. What I don't. Not anthropomorphic, but I guess it's.
Oh, it's
called
definitely
zoomorphic. Well, zoomorphic is
zoomorphic, yeah.
is the word we use for human that I had to learn when I had to change anthropomorphic to zoomorphic in an essay on
Noted.
On Mouse at the last minute. But anyway, yeah. So what went into the choice of? I know there's the kind of ethical consideration of drawing of how you drawing your daughter as she appears or she looks in real life, but what went into the choice of the unicorn in particular?
You bet. So yeah, beyond the basic consent thing, like I'm telling my story, which isn't my story, it's my family's story. Since my kids can't consent, this was the easiest possible ethical workaround. The second would simply be like children born in the 2010s, like, born in 2011, unicorns were all the rage. Sparkly unicorns,
Oh, God,
filled
yes.
my life. Like I still sleep on a Rainbow Dash pillow that my kids kept booting down to me, and that's been my pillow for like the last 5 years of my life. The other side is rarity. Basically, so yes, there is like this is low-hanging fruit in terms of symbolism. But yes, unicorns, they are magical. A lot of some of the subtext here is like knowing, like raising kids from 2015 to 2020. It's a little bit of taking the wonder of the world away and watching the glow fade. But that's the story of becoming a part of the world, is like recognizing we have roles, we have responsibilities, and it is an inevitable part of human existence to have a little bit of that taken away from us. It just hurts when it's your kids. So that was the obvious aesthetic choice for the unicorn, but also like the zoomorphizing, the zoomorphizing of my kids. The other thing was like, I never had interest in doing a memoir comic. I felt compelled to tell this story of like the sort of private and personal impact of this authoritarian power grab within my family unit, because by the end of 2017, I realized that these exact feelings of like anxiety, dread, doubt, rage, occasional flashes of hope, these were so broadly experienced. And even in 2017, I would argue a large chunk of moderate, sane conservative families and parents, it's just that they normalized all of it much quicker and were like, oh, well, I'll go back to work or whatever. So I felt compelled to make this book simply because my family's experiences were utterly ununique. It was the fact that, so by making my kids not my kids, the point was the reader is explicitly supposed to see the young people in their lives. And again, just easy fix, the power of comics. You
Exactly.
turn your child into a weird fox, deer, unicorn, and all of a sudden, if you have a child in your life, it's much easier to use that masking to jump in there.
Great. Well, thanks. I want to give us some time for questions. So since we got a lot of people here. Okay, Irene, go ahead.
Her hand always shoots up first.
Thank you so much. Each of your books are protest comics in themselves in some way. Can you tell us about how your comics may have been met by the current cultural book banning movement, or how such comics can resist this movement?
Wow. Kent State, not at all, surprisingly. I mean, my friend Dahmer is constantly banned. I was a little surprised by that, actually. I mean, considering it came out when it came out, that it would get more political blowback, especially in Ohio, but it didn't at all. I have no explanation for that. I don't know. Maybe the events are so far in the past now that all you see is the horror of it. That innocent kids were gunned down, and there's almost no one that can justify that. Some kid walking with his lunch through a parking lot has a bullet go through the back of his neck. I mean, how can even the most staunchest Republican justify that? I don't know. I'm kind of I was kind of mystified by that.
I guess this will serve as a tiny update of information I've been able to collect over this year. All right, so thinking now post first wave of book ban, reality averse legislation and intimidation and threats. All right, so March, to my surprise, has avoided being on any of the major cut and paste book ban lists. And I actually anticipated and planned ahead that once Lies My Teacher Told Me came out in April, I was like, oh, it'll obviously be banned on day one in particular markets or states. Did not happen. But this is where, number one, on a fundamental level, the intimidation and the lists and the risk that educators and librarians face of losing their jobs, their safety, etc., was and has been so effective that it is not that necessary to outright ban a lot of books. So with March, for example, it's definitely been a case, we've been challenged and banned in a couple of individual prison systems and jails and stuff. But in terms of this moment and this movement, it's a case of soft censorship where the presumption is teachers, librarians, etc., are simply choosing another title or going in a different direction. There's also no paper trail for this. It's like locating a black hole. Mm-hmm. So for me, the only evidence I have, like locating a black hole, is my royalty check. And yet, the books are a decade old, so a little bit of a dip, but it's enough of a 30% dip where you're this is the black hole. Be this is teachers and schools choosing a different direction. Mm-hmm. And then the next wave after that, juicy news from SPX, mm-hmm. was somebody who's in Florida. This is very Orwellian, but basically being the next step post book ban is that there are no banned books in public school districts in Florida because you are free to use in a classroom any books from this list of pre-approved books. They don't have book bans, you see. Mm-hmm. You can use any of the books on this one list. So slipperier and slipperier, but also showing the success of that wave of intimidation and violence.
For me, it probably doesn't apply because it's a Canadian subject matter, so no one's gonna ban that. One of the curious things about the whole book banning thing is that it seems for them, the extreme right wing people doing this, it seems counterproductive, I would imagine, because of the fact that, if I'm not mistaken, I think that almost as soon as a book appears on these lists, their sales skyrocket. So why would they want? It doesn't make sense. Why would they want to add attention to these books and increase their sales? But then that's kind of what you just mentioned, Nate, about this whole other. This is a very underhanded way of doing it. Instead of actually doing a book ban, you just have this list, and that way you don't have to draw attention to all these books that you don't want.
It's like when the leader of Iran around 2011 was we don't have homosexuals in Iran or whatever. You guys remember that? Remember the Lonely Island video when the president of Iran or whatever visited New York City or whatever? But yeah, in terms of cultural control, mm-hmm. being able to completely flip the script. Right. But my short answer to that is, they are playing the long game. It doesn't matter if there is a massive uptick in interest and sales of these books. Like, this is where they are fascists. Like, in the long term, the goal is total social control. So be like, sure, become a bestseller. That's fine. You go ahead. You sell 20,000 more books. It won't matter to us in 20 years.
It's still, it's hurting. I mean, it affects school sales, which are a huge part of, graphic novel sales now. It affects library sales. I mean, it's definitely having an effect. Someone like gets a lot of press, like, Spiegelman with Mouse, and it shot back up the bestseller list, but there are 50 other books and creators who don't get that kind of press, and their sales are impacted. Yeah, no, it's insidious.
Like those Texas school lists that might have something like 800 books on them, and so the ones that get most of the attention might have a little boost, but the ones that are kind of buried in the middle that weren't all that well known to begin with are getting impacted.
And let's not lose sight of the fact that this started out as a good old fashioned comic book witch hunt. That's where it started. In Texas, it started with graphic novels, LGBTQ graphic novels. That's where it started with. And then they started casting a wider net. But it's Dr. Wortham shit all over again.
Okay. Other questions? Yeah, Dan.
Curious, each of you wrote about protest movements surrounding a specific set of issues. Like, do you find yourself kind of like thinking, man, if I could just advise these guys at the time,
Advise them. From our throne of wisdom up there at the top of comicdom.
Because I think one thing I would ask if I was in your shoes is like, were these movements successful, and what stopped them from being successful if they weren't? And I just wonder if you went through any of that thought process in your books.
For me, I feel like the consistent theme has been coming from a place of not knowing, but especially realizing I came to certain things, like being a Southern boy with Southern parents, learning a certain amount about the civil rights movement as a kid in the 80s, but that was actually a set of assumptions that I entered March and Silence of Our Friends with, and then realizing that I don't know anything, because 70% of that was misleading or false. And so actually, like, I very quickly kind of established myself in a place where I was like, oh, I'm relearning all of this. So I didn't have anything even remotely no feeling of like 21st century hindsight or anything. I couldn't see the train at the end of the tunnel because I was like, oh, this is a new tunnel. Where is this tunnel going?
Yep.
Just interested in hearing from any of you how you negotiated the representation of historical reality, like in terms of place and time, because you're doing something that's sort of like a documentary, but you're expressing yourself artistically. How far did you feel like you had to go in okay, this building was on this corner?
Oh God, I was like down the rabbit hole. I mean, there's 25 pages of footnotes at the back of the book, which like detail every source. I mean, I spent 2 years researching the book and acquiring all that photo reference, and just to the most ridiculous extreme. I mean, I just got lost in it. And, the students of 1970, all of them have said to me, it's like, wow, man, you really nailed the town and nailed the campus. I was like, yes. Though I did get one roof line wrong on campus, and every time I look at that fucking book, I see it. And it drives me crazy. But otherwise, yeah, no, I really went to an extreme, because I felt that I owed it to the time and the place. And yeah, it was very important. I think all of us we're dealing with period pieces. You've got to get the period right, because it's so different than the period now. And there's so much that has changed, and you have to you want to take the reader back in your TARDIS and just drop them off. Say, okay, see you when you're done with the book, and then, let them look around. And that's the goal.
Well, in terms of owing it, I think for all three of our books, This is still within living memory. So we're talking about movements where there is a certain percentage of people who are still with us, and we are depicting those people who are still here with us today. So especially particularly in the Selma movement, having a much more heightened sense of the individuals who were involved and the individuals who were in the first 50 people of the march on Bloody Sunday in particular. But there was a sense that like you not only should you nail it, but you owe it to the people whose names are often swept under the rug to be like
Or denigrated.
Yes, yes.
As certainly with the civil rights movement and with Kent State.
But you're like, at least I can get this rooftop.
Exactly.
Like, for real.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You can get their voice out there.
And Chris, you've got 25 pages of notes too in the back. I just counted. But your notes are interesting because they'll often just point out where you made certain choices, right? That you had. Yep. We got to wrap up, but just kind of throw that question to you then. Like, what about making? How did you decide to do that as part of your notes?
Right. Usually, if I did, for example, had two conflicting points of view, I would cite it in the notes. And in terms of your question about capturing the scenery, and I think we all did it. I mean, it was really important to make sure we got it. You get things right. I was lucky enough because everything in my book takes place in the city that I live in Montreal. And many instances just only like a 10 or 15-minute walk from where I live. So even though I had reference photos, it was always important for me to go to the place where the incident took place. And I always had to be there because I felt that, I know this sounds strange, but there's something when you're there. Mm-hmm. I'm sure that with Kent State, that was really important for you. I guess you get a sense of what happened.
You put yourself in that space,
right?
You feel what the space is like around you,
right?
And
even on a blocking level,
right, exactly.
Directorial level,
very, very important for if you're writing, nonfiction, if you can put yourself in that space.
Well, we're out of time, so thanks everybody. Thanks to the panel.
Thanks, guys.
Everybody but Derf's tabling, so
yeah, I'm sorry.